In this talk, we're going to be focusing on Le Corbusier and his personal background and early practice and career. Honestly, this is probably the most famous architect in the world of the 20th century. Nobody needs to be explained about the importance of Le Corbusier. But often he's looked at as this phenomenal practitioner, and we look at his buildings and we just kind of obsess on those things, those objects. But in fact, Le Corbusier was a very significant theorist, and he took theory very, very seriously. He very intentionally developed his own ideas about architecture, and then the work emanated from those ideas. So in this talk, what we're really focusing on is, where did he come from as an individual? What different experiences did he go through that led him to certain ideas and directions and positions about architecture? So let's talk about this guy, Le Corbusier. It's amazing how much people know about Le Corbusier, but still, in a way, how little they know about Le Corbusier. I was really privileged to spend some time doing research at Fondation Le Corbusier in Paris, and in that period was able to live in Le Corbusier's apartment. Probably nothing gives you more insight into someone as a human being than living in their home. And in that case, Le Corbusier had just died. They closed up the apartment. This was years later, but basically I just opened the door and his clothes are in the closet and everything is just like he left it. And being an inquisitive kind of guy, I rifled through everything and really felt like I got to know Le Corbusier. I will hopefully bring to our discussion section a hat that was Le Corbusier's hat, which they allowed me to take away at the end of that time I lived in this place. Very precious thing for me. So Le Corbusier was a kid growing up in La Chaux-de-Fonds, this tiny little town in the western part of Switzerland. It's only about 5 kilometers from the French border. It was a watchmaking town. Of course, the Swiss were famous for watchmaking in this era. And his father worked in the watchmaking industry. His mother was a musician, and she taught piano. His brother was a musician, a violinist. They were a very cultured family and a fairly affluent family. At the age of 15, Le Corbusier goes to art school, and he's actually training to do engraving and ornamentation on watches. So La Chaux-de-Fonds was so much about watchmaking. Even the art school there was kind of focused on the art of the clock or the art of the watch. But in art school, he ran across a guy named Charles Le Plantinier, who was one of the teachers there. Le Plantinier was extremely knowledgeable about new things that were happening in Europe at the time. He had studied in Budapest and he'd studied in Paris, and he was very familiar with these new movements, what was called Art Nouveau in France and practiced by people like Hector Guimard, known as Jugendstil, the young style in Vienna, and practiced by people like Joseph Hoffmann. It was often referred to as a secessionist style in Germany, meaning we're seceding from the old way of doing things. But just in this moment, there were these rebellious movements in various different countries in Europe. And Charles Le Plantinier embedded that notion in Le Corbusier. He let him know about these rebellious new ideas, often based in a reattachment to nature or based in a reattachment to geometry, but looking to eschew style and to invent painting, design, architecture from something more authentic. So Charles Le Plantinier was very, very influential at a very early age on Le Corbusier. By the time he was 16, he had decided he wanted to be an architect. There really was no architecture school at that time in the region that he could attend. So he continued on in the art school for a little while, But he decided he was going to have to be self-taught. And he took very seriously this notion of, I'm going to teach myself how to be an architect. So he spent a lot of time in libraries, spent a lot of time in museums. He was reading not just architecture books, he was reading philosophy books. He understood there's a theory behind architecture. I want to understand that. He learned construction, working on construction sites and observing construction sites. And he kept these sketchbooks. He was constantly drawing buildings. These were the mechanisms he used to educate himself as an architect. And part of that education came in the form of trips. In 1907, so he would have been 20 years old, he took a major trip to Paris and to Italy, and he saw things that were very, very inspiring to him. That was kind of his first big jaunt outside of Switzerland. He also went to Vienna. He got to meet Gustav Klimt, the artist, very famous rebellious artist, sort of Jugendstil artist in Vienna. Wanted very much to meet Hoffmann, Joseph Hoffmann, but never got the opportunity to do that, and returned then back to La Chaux-de-Fonds. But these trips, super, super important, where he was actually going and seeing places and buildings. He went to a monastery outside of Florence that he loved. Not a famous building, but this kind of housing that was in the monastery that he enjoyed immensely, the simplicity of it, the practicality of it. That trip gave him a little bit of a thirst for getting out of town, getting out of La Chaux-de-Fonds. So 1908 to 1910, he moved to Paris, and for 14 months he worked for the French architect Auguste Perret. Auguste Perret was one of the most famous French artists of the era, a big proponent of reinforced concrete, a great innovator in reinforced concrete, and that was a very influential period on Le Corbusier. Then he went from there to Berlin, and for a short period of time he worked for Peter Behrens, again an extremely famous, accomplished architect in Berlin. At that time when he worked for Peter Behrens in Berlin, Mies van der Rohe and Walter Gropius were also working for Peter Behrens in Berlin. So you can imagine, here's Peter Behrens, in the head of the office, and Mies and Gropius and Le Corbusier are all young architects working in the office. He terminates that employment and then goes on another big trip. This is his self-education in architecture. And on this trip, it's a bit longer trip. He goes to Greece and to Rome. He goes to Turkey, the Balkans. On that trip, he filled 80 sketchbooks. And those are still at Fondation Le Corbusier. Absolutely amazing to see these sketchbooks, just scribbling everything. Vernacular Greek villages, those little white stucco boxy villages. Tons of sketches of those. Also then, he fell in love with the Parthenon, and many, many, many sketches of the Parthenon. And the kind of ode to the Parthenon you will read you read in Toward a New Architecture really came from his exposure to the Parthenon on that trip in 1911. He then returns from that trip and goes back to La Chaux-de-Fonds. He's on this mission to learn how to be an architect. So he's worked for great people, he's traveled a lot, he's read, he's sketched, he's learning all these things. And now he goes back to Le Chaux-de-Fonds and he does a house for his father. And even though earlier in his career he had the opportunity to do some rather naive buildings in Le Chaux-de-Fonds, and we'll look at them in the next talk. This is his chance to really use what he's been accumulating in these travels and working in these offices to try to do something a little more sophisticated in the house for his father in 1912. While he was back in Le Chaux-de-Fonds, he taught at his old school. And then in 1916, he got this really amazing commission, especially for a young architect like he was, a commission to do a major house for one of the leaders of that community, and that was the Villa Schwab. And it was a house that was built in reinforced concrete. It was very much influenced by Auguste Perret, but it was him again, trying to make something new, make something his own, and not just a kind of naive reproduction, which he saw other architects doing. When he completes the Villa Schwab, he sort of says, you know, I've done everything I can here in Le Chaux-de-Fonds, and he moves back to Paris. And from 1918 to 1922, he does a very, very unusual thing for a young architect. He stops designing and he stops building. And for 4 years, he does nothing but painting and theory, painting and theory. And it was an effort on his part to really think deeper and deeper and deeper about this field I want to go into. He met a young artist named Amédée Ozenfant shortly after he got to Paris. Ozenfant was part of a group that produced a little journal called L'Esprit Nouveau, the New Spirit, and it was about art and design and architecture, and it was essays. It was primarily theory. LeCorbusier was very involved in the running of L'Esprit Nouveau, but also wrote a great deal for L'Esprit Nouveau. So a lot of the content of Toward a New Architecture is really those essays kind of strung together in Toward a New Architecture. The book was published in 1923. It was almost immediately translated into English and other languages and became a worldwide phenomena. Generally, it's thought of to be the most influential book on architecture of the first half of the 20th century. And he immediately had a presence and a voice and was a kind of major figure in architecture. So at that point, he's in his 30s. He's extremely well known, and he goes back to building again. In 1922, he takes his first commission he's taken in 4 years, and begins to try to build those ideas he expressed in Toward a New Architecture. And that's really what we'll be talking about in the next talk.